microphone and turned it backwards so that I didn't see that it was muted.
A prank.
All right. Well, so we didn't get our opening spiel off, and we'll just do that, a very brief version of it then. Thank you for pointing out that you couldn't hear us.
Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour.
This is not therapy. It's just an open conversation. We're streaming on 3 platforms at once. If you can participate in the chat and are willing to, we appreciate that. And we will read out comments so that everybody's on the same page. That's the fast version.
Yeah.
All right. How you doing?
I'm okay.
What's on your mind? Or what's on your mind?
Yeah.
Anybody? Well, that's something we didn't say the first go around, but we can say now, like, don't hesitate or wait. Don't worry that you're like taking this off topic or try and keep it, just throw it out there. I thought it was moving to This Is Not Us Talking Hour.
I mean, now that makes me think of the people who mute their TV and then make the voices over the performers and give it its own dialogue.
The people who do
The
that?
people that I've seen talk about doing
Do
that.
you do that?
No, but I've seen people like, I did this quirky thing with my significant other.
I have never seen anyone do it. I have seen it referenced
Yes.
as like a quirky
Agreed.
thing that quirky people do.
Yes.
The only time I can actually think of that is in a show that I watched that I found to be very annoying, where part of my annoyance was how much the lead was also the head writer, and like it was their show,
Mm-hmm.
and it was very much written like, look, I'm awesome. I'm so awesome that I don't even think that I'm awesome. I think I'm just goofy, and it's like everybody else is weird and bad and does bad stuff. But like, I hate shows and movies like that where
That are
let's put it in a way that keeps coming up in terms of like our work,
okay.
therapy, and executive functioning, is that the thing that people are always talking about being worried. Oh wait, one day I'll edit a session of notes with my voice, a session of yours with my voiceovers. I might have too much time.
That's so funny.
That would be fun.
Animations too, if anybody knows how to animate. Make a little This Is Not Therapy Hour animation.
If a person talks to you about like, I'm really worried that I'm dumb, or I really think I'm dumb, or whatever, almost always they would prefer thinking that to thinking that they might be smart. The stuff that we are the most afraid might be true about us is the stuff that it's uncomfortable to even acknowledge the possibility that it might be true. And so we think of it as cannot possibly be true.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm using that example because that one comes up a lot, right? That like, if I am deeply worried that I'm actually very capable and competent and smart and whatever, that I could accomplish all kinds of things, if I'm so worried about that, then I'm like, no, that's just not true. I'm not. And if anybody were to try and say that, and people often do, people say I'm smart, but I don't get it. I'm not. Like, can't even be reckoned with the possibility. But then the flip side of that is like, well, if I'm not that, then maybe I'm in the other direction further than I want to be. And now I become very worried. Yeah, like more dumb than I would, like it's fine. I'm not smart. That's fine. But I'm like average or, maybe a little above average, whatever. But sometimes I'm like, or am I dumb? And I just think that I'm average or above average. Do people think I'm dumb? Whatever.
Stressful.
So that's the one that we then start to focus on and be like genuinely worried. So if you say to somebody like, you're really worried about whether you're smart, they'll be like, no, I know I'm not. That's not I'm worried about whether I'm dumb, because it's the result of that other fear that is. So what happens a lot in this stuff where the writer is on board, it's like a tropey way to refer to, like how cars will have baby on board signs. Writer on board is like when you're watching something where it's like, okay, this show, like the writer is very obvious here, like they're accomplishing.
I've watched movies where I'm like, oh, this is the writer acting right now, or like you just know.
Yeah, that they're trying to accomplish something. And one that I am seeing a lot of lately, and it's annoying to me, especially because it shows up in shows that have some really great elements to them, and so I still like the show and watch the show overall, but this part of it sucks, is they're worried that they are like bad people. they're worried that like maybe I'm a person who is kind of misogynistic or is kind of
Same.
racist or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So then they write into the script all kinds of stuff where it's showing how like, no, people who have concerns and criticisms about this are right, but in ways that they don't quite seem to process. It seems unintentional, at least. And if they're doing it intentionally, then it's great writing because they're hiding that they're doing it intentionally.
They're doing a show don't tell, or are they telling?
No, that's the thing.
That's the problem.
I could name a few different shows, and I mean, I'm acting like I need to protect these shows, and I don't need to, but it just doesn't matter. I'm happy to talk about
Okay.
it. I can name a few different shows where there's plot lines where it's like a character is introduced who is very coded as like, this is the Gen Z, like social justice person. And they say all kinds of stuff about capitalism and patriarchy and whatever. And everyone in the show keeps acting as though that person is being very reasonable and like that any objections to that are outdated and whatever. But the audience is given a very clear impression. It would be unreasonable for an audience member to walk away from that show agreeing that that person is the reasonable one.
Say that again.
All right, let me just use a specific example to make the point. The first show that's coming to my mind that my wife and I have been watching recently is called Stick. It's an Apple TV show. Owen Wilson and Mark Maron are the like famous actor leads in it.
Okay.
And the basic premise is like Owen Wilson is a failed / retired professional guy. Like he was a good professional golfer. His career fell apart. He's been just kind of like killing time, whatever, lost track of his life. But now he's met this kid who's a great golfer and he wants to like mentor this kid. And, you know, he's found a passion and whatever again. And at a certain point, a new character gets introduced that is like roughly the kid's age, who they don't explicitly state this, but the kid refers to them with they them pronouns. The character's name is Zero. I'm trying to remember this just to make the conversation easier to have. And they are like very politically minded, right? Don't eat red meat because of how the processes of raising and slaughtering and distributing it impacts the environment, and doesn't deal with misogynistic bullcrap and a lot of stuff that's really very cool. They also are introduced as someone who is like another voice in the ear. Owen Wilson's character is trying to like help this kid and bring him along, and then this other person comes along and like he listens to Zero more than he listens to, I wish I could remember the guy, Owen Wilson's character's name, but whatever. And Owen Wilson's character is a very sympathetic character. He's presented that way to the audience, especially given like some things that the audience is told about him that the other characters don't know. But the action of the episode is constantly just like him doing something that the audience is going to think of as like reasonable. Even when he does something that's like shitty, it's still like, all right, it's not that bad. I mean, like he didn't like full out yell. He just said like, you got to get your head in the game, which is a pretty common like coaching thing. And then he spends the rest of the episode like apologizing for having treated the guy so poorly, and everyone's acting like that is the case. And it's unreasonable that most audience members will come to the same conclusion, especially because he immediately spends the rest of the episode apologizing. So he's portrayed as the character who like can recognize when he makes a mistake. And these other people, though, they are unforgiving and they are stubborn and whatever. So the action of the episode is all about like Zero's making very good points, and but the audience is going to be left with an impression of like, okay, that sucks, like that person's ridiculous or whatever. Which comes across to me, again, I don't know, but it comes across to me as though the writer has complaints with people like that or that kind of rhetoric, and is portraying it, whether they recognize it or not, as like, look how ridiculous this rhetoric is or these people are. But they also know that like, no, I can't. It's not that. There's some very valid, like they genuinely do agree with many of the points about social justice and whatever. And so this is the like thing that comes out of that conflict. If that makes sense.
It does.
So the fears that people are most focused on are the fears that they would prefer to think about than the other fears that they're not thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that there aren't other fears. It's just some, and it doesn't mean that they like thinking about them or that they feel good. They don't. That's the whole point. If it did, then they would have to find something else to like be like, oh, I'm worried about this thing. We need something to worry about.
We need something to worry about.
Yeah.
Why?
It's the nature of cognition. Cognition is problem solving.
I hate that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of us do, but so many of the problems that people are dealing with is just like we're trying to do things with cognition that it is not able to do, not meant to do. Like so much of what we talk about, especially the stuff that gets perceived as being very different and very helpful, is just different outcomes of people wanting to think of human cognition as this magical thing that can provide eternal happiness if you do it right.
Right.
But no, yeah, thinking is not pleasant, like we talked about, in the same way that holding something is not pleasant. The activity you're engaged in can be pleasant, and the amount of resources you're expending on holding or thinking can be so little that they're so outweighed by the, whatever it is you're doing that you're like, no, I like it. But you don't like holding something, you just like the activity, and to do the activity requires that you're holding something.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were to have that same thing and someone were to say like, hey, you cannot put that down, then immediately you start thinking about like, oh no, that's not.
Uh-huh.
So thinking is meant to be done like using your muscles or anything else, like in short bursts. You use it, you rest it, you use it, you rest it. But we don't think of it that way, so we try to just think our way through everything and never rest.
I think I know these answers, but how does one not think or rest it, rather?
So the funny thing, and I'll answer that, but the funny thing is that's the question people will ask, and what they generally mean is, what's the understanding that you can give me that if I were to think this way differently, then I wouldn't be thinking so much?
Sure.
And it's an example then of the problem.
Right.
You come up against a description of something that isn't how you want it to be. You're like, so certainly if I think about it in some different way, then it will be better. But the answer to that question is their attention has to be drawn elsewhere.
I knew you were going to say that. Direct your attention elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Well, but it's not direct your attention elsewhere.
It's just somewhere else.
No. Your attention has to be drawn elsewhere.
What's the difference?
We're changing who's the subject of that statement, who's doing it. When we say direct your attention elsewhere, that means you direct your attention elsewhere. When we say your attention has to be drawn elsewhere, it just means whatever things that might happen, which could include you, but whatever things might happen that would draw your attention to that thing. Direct your attention elsewhere doesn't work, because what are you going to try and do? Think how to, like, I'll just think about putting my direct. Right. No, that's a thought.
That's why entertainment is nice. Movies and TVs.
That is one of the reasons that entertainment is nice, yeah.
It's one of the reasons.
It is, and it's important because the reason that this stuff tends to go unnoticed. Oh, wait, no wonder most of my life was fun, not thinking things through, avoided so much worry. Is there a philosophy built on not thinking? First of all, yes, there is a philosophy built on not thinking. I mean, you could argue that there are several philosophies built on that, but Buddhism is a notable one that prioritizes like not spending your resources in your own cognitive environment.
Stresses me out, Brandon.
Why?
Thinking about not thinking.
Yeah, which ironically is conclusions that are derived via a process of thinking. Like in Buddhism specifically, Gautama Buddha, and I don't want to claim to be an expert on this, and there are many different versions of Buddhism, but like one of the very common stories about the person who brought Buddhism to China is that he sat in a cave, not moving or doing anything, just staring at the wall for 9 years, I believe it is, and then like a hole was drilled through the wall of the cave from the intensity of his gaze that never moved away from it. But sitting under the tree, like sit and think. But yes, it emphasizes that life is an illusion. And
I think about like if in the past I've like driven to the beach in Indiana to get away and just relax or whatever. But because I'm thinking this is the thing that's going to help me relax, I'm more stressed because I think I'm not taking advantage of the beach. I'm not.
Yep.
Yeah.
This is one of the most frustrating things to try and help people to learn is that we like, so if I just like play some video games to get my mind off it no, that won't work. Playing video games would work, but not playing video games so that you can get your mind off it.
Right.
Any thought about the thing you're trying not to think about, including thoughts about what you could do in order to not think about it, any thought about those things is a thought about those things.
Right.
So yes, one of the problematic cycles that people get stuck in is they're actively doing things. Like one very common version of this ends up in depression, very severe depression. Like, I have stopped doing everything. I'm sleeping, I'm resting, I'm doing nothing, and I still am exhausted all the time. What's going on? Well, not always, but one of the things that can cause that to happen is that you're doing all those things in order to not be depressed. But then anything you're doing is just an attempt to not be depressed.
Find a cave.
Which is a thought about your depression, which that's what's happening, right? When people are sleeping 12 hours a day, but I can't get out of bed, I'm exhausted, they're thinking a lot about how depressed they are, which isn't fake, doesn't make it not real, it's real. So anyway, the reason I jumped in on that thing is because one of the things that gets in the way in our culture is we call things distractions.
Yeah.
I'm just doing it to distract myself. Calling something a distraction centers the other thing. Distract myself from X. And the implicit statement is that the value of the thing I'm doing is just that it's not X. But that can never be the case because anything that isn't X isn't X. Why this thing? And so by calling it a distraction and framing that the only point of it is to make it so I don't think about X, I ignore the value of what's here in this thing. And again, I turn now doing this thing into another thought about X.
I am getting stressed thinking about vacations where I have been relaxed and how little I remember from them.
Yeah.
And placing so much value on like, it's only valuable if I remember this.
Yeah. Which part of you thinks that?
My thinking part?
Yeah.
My thinking part.
Your body doesn't give a crap about remembering stuff. It literally is incapable of remembering stuff. It couldn't value it. Just like this will stress you out too. I'm pretty sure we've done it before, but think about a time in your life in which you were very happy and tell me, what did that feel like? And you can't really answer that question because any time in your life that you think of as being very happy is not a time that you remember those kinds of details because you weren't in your own cognition to pay attention to what your experience was.
A lot of it is I just think of the pictures from the moment.
Yeah, you're thinking about the stuff that was happening.
Come on, a forest come from? Okay, love a cave. Love a good forest run, maybe 10 years ago.
Forrest Gump.
I know Forrest Gump, but I read Forrest and Run first.
Now the point of many like meditative practices, and I should say as always, like this is filtered through my understanding, my cultural upbringing, the things that I notice and how I interpret them and how I remember them is filtered through. So to whatever extent it's accurate, the point, and to my understanding of many different kinds of meditative practices, is to get you to not think. Specifically to not think even while you're not doing
counterintuitive.
anything. Yes, that's why many Westerners, that's a very common complaint about meditation. It's like, meditation doesn't work for me because I sit there and I just think about stuff. I'm guessing, I don't know this. I assume that that is not actually the point of these meditative practices and that that's like a Western way of kind of confusing the point.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, surely it's got to be about controlling our thoughts in some way, even if what we're saying is like controlling them by not having them.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as I can tell, like when doing these things or whatever. And so what I assume is that, no, it's about not trying to control them, not have them or don't have them, just stop trying to control them, which recently got packaged as mindfulness in the West. And that got a lot of notoriety. I don't know. It made a lot of headway for people like, oh, so the point is to just step aside and observe your thoughts without trying to interact with them or judge them or control them, just observe them, which is great. But then over time, it still just gets twisted back into like, if you do this exercise, then you can control your thoughts. Mm-hmm. If you're anxious, do a mindfulness exercise, and now you will no longer be anxious, which is the opposite of the point of mindfulness, even though that sometimes does work. But when that works, it's because the anxiety that you're trying to respond to is an anxiety that is stemming from judgment of your own thoughts. So by stepping aside and not judging them, that anxiety goes away. But if you're anxious, for example, because like, I don't know, you got a huge test coming up that you think you're going to fail and it's really important, then like mindfulness exercises, for the moment, it'll pull your attention to the thing, and so less on that. But once that's done, it goes right back.
Yeah, I don't know. I think anytime I had like an audition the next day or a test the next, well, actually, I'm finding exceptions as I'm speaking. Never mind.
Yeah, the premise there is that feeling anxiety in the cognitive sense of anxiety, thoughts racing, worried about like potential bad things happening. The premise is that that is a bad thing that shouldn't happen, as opposed to an unpleasant thing that we, of course, don't want to happen and want to prevent from happening and want to stop it as soon as possible when it does happen. That's all true. That doesn't make it a bad thing that shouldn't happen. And if we respond to it like it is a bad thing that shouldn't happen, we're quite likely to do things that make it worse over the long run. It's an evolution driven by being gentle with self. The thought pops in, don't say you're bad at this. See, that's the kind of, I don't want to jump on everything, and I might not be reading it or interpreting it accurately, but maybe the most common thing as a therapist that I see people coming in with is a belief that they shouldn't say should all the time, right? Like they recognize that it's not good for me to think of it as I should do this or I should do that or whatever, without recognizing that that thought itself
Is a should.
Is a thought about what you should or shouldn't do. I shouldn't say should to myself, is you perpetuating the problem. That's why these things, like when people talk about the same fears and concerns a lot, why these things persist is because we're comfortable with that solution, even though it isn't working in some ways, and it most likely, almost always, is working in many, many ways. But there are some places where it's not only not working, but actually making it worse. We are not comfortable with getting rid of it, in part because it's helping with many things, in part because the idea that you don't know can be more disturbing than the idea that you do know, even though it's not working for you. I know if I just blank, it would work, but I think, okay, that's a hypothetically true statement. But if you can't blank, if you've been trying to blank and it's not working, you don't get yourself to or whatever, doesn't matter. All of it means that blank is not an effective strategy for you. But it's still preferable to be like, no, I know how to solve it in theory, than to be like, well, I got to figure out something else then, I guess. Or even worse, deal with that maybe it's not something I can solve. Yeah, no. I would argue that one of the maybe the underlying axiomatic premise of Western culture is the idea that thinking is good. You know, that like man without rational thought is a bad thing. Beastly or savage or violent or aggressive or whatever. And that only through what in some literature is referred to as like civilizing force, but only through being civilized are we then able to become good. And that is all that's based on and reinforces the idea of like your body's impulses are bad, your logical mind and the conclusions that you come to with it are good, and that everything in life is just, if it's bad, it's because your body's doing something and you haven't used the logic right, or because you got some bad logic and intentionally did something, but then you just need the good logic. A complete disregard for what are some pretty obvious truths, if you think about it for a moment. Like, if that's the case, then how did humanity get to the point where we were able to develop what we now refer to as the civilizing factors or civilization or whatever? If without that we just all kill each other, then why didn't we all kill each other? I'm very careful about saying should, because every time I use the phrase with
one therapist I had, they would jump on it, and I didn't want to have to keep explaining why I feel like I should each time rather than just finishing what I was talking about. A good example of someone doing something with good intentions that has the opposite impact for what they're going for.
Mm-hmm.
It is valuable to question what we mean by should. That is not the same thing as it is bad to say should. Just like it is valuable to explore why we're anxious and what to do about it, it's not the same thing as it's bad to be anxious.
I hear a lot of people say, I'm intentionally using the word should right here.
Yes, that's a way to prevent other people from responding like this.
Right.
Yeah. Don't tell me not to say should. I am aware of your concerns. I'm using it anyway. Obviously, it's a useful piece of language.
Mm-hmm.
And like any tool, it has its limitations and it causes problems when it's used in ways that are beyond certain parameters. That doesn't make it bad. Like, yes, we shorthand things. We should shorthand things sometimes. You know, like when I say to my wife or children, I love you, I don't need to go into like, this is the specific things that I think and do in your presence or in response to considering you or whatever that are my evidence or add up to the concept of what I deem to be love. Like, that's not what the whole point of language is, to make small symbols that represent other larger things. Language is not bad language to use. There are times and ways that we use language and it has different impacts than we want, or even the opposite impact of what we're trying to have. That still doesn't make it bad to use. And if you think of it as being bad, so should is what I'm talking about here, right? There are ways in which people use the word should that causes problems. Absolutely. That doesn't mean it's a bad word and you should never use it. Again, to say you shouldn't use should uses the word should in it. Should is just a placeholder, a simplification, a way of saying like, it would be beneficial or some version of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why and in what specific way it would be beneficial to do this thing, or that I'm expected to do this thing, is going to vary from one to the next.
Mm-hmm.
But that's all. And it's useful to explore it because sometimes people say I should X without any concept of why theoretically it would be beneficial, other than that's what people want. And that is also a very good and useful and important placeholder. Like, we are wired to do what we deem other people would want us to do, because it's a good strategy.
Before ourselves?
What does that mean?
I don't know. I know you've talked about how, like, yes, it makes sense to want to do things for other people. That's like a survival thing. But, like, is there a, what did I ask you?
Before ourselves, before what we would want ourselves to do.
Yeah.
How do you formulate what you want yourself to do?
Based on other people.
If you want to do something because you think other people will like it, is that not you wanting to do it now? Who told you that you shouldn't want to do things like that? Did you come to that conclusion on your own, or did other people tell you that you should prioritize your own wants more than other people's?
My therapy is stressful.
That's one of the reasons, yeah. Look, if you're walking down a street, crowded street, and then everybody starts running the other way and screaming,
Mm-hmm.
what are you going to do?
Probably go where everyone else is going.
Yeah. Is it possible that they're all wrong and yeah, yes, that's possible. But the stakes are different, right? Like, if we're all running and it's not necessary, then like, oh, well, we're embarrassed or we wasted some resources running or whatever. If I don't run, turns out it was necessary, well, now I'm dead. So of course you run.
Yeah.
And we explicitly tell stories. It's a very common scene in movies to show everyone else running away and the protagonist going toward.
Right.
And we think of ourselves as it's an admirable thing about being the one who runs toward the danger.
I notice myself, I don't know if it's being indecisive or just changing my mind very quickly when a context changes, or if it's anxiety or what, but it's really stressing me out lately, Brandon.
What is?
Me changing my mind.
That stresses you out?
Yes.
Why?
Because I'm like, well, what did you want? What do you actually want?
You're changing your mind specifically about something you want. I want this. No, I want that.
Yes, I want this, or maybe I think of it this way now, or like I keep getting new perspectives.
And why would that stress you out?
Because then it feels you're right. I'm thinking that it's something wrong with me.
Yeah, because where did you get the idea that a person changing their mind about what they want is something that is a bad thing and it shouldn't happen? And if it does happen, it's an indication that something wrong
From
is going on.
somebody.
Yeah, that's the thing. You tell people like, hey, you should prioritize what you want, not just what everybody else wants. And you say it in good faith, and the impact you're trying to have is a good one. You're trying to help give. I'll point out there would be no point in saying it except that you have some underlying belief, not that you're consciously thinking in that moment, that they might change how they think and feel and act in response to what you tell them they should do. Otherwise, why would I say you should prioritize what you want? What a waste that would be, unless if I say that, maybe it makes it so that you do think and feel it, do different
It's
things.
not helping me.
It's a lie. It's
It's
not
a lie.
possible.
What's
We
the-
say it in good faith to try and help people. But if you run it out to its conclusions, this is what happens. Again, that doesn't mean that it's bad and you should never say it. It's to say that it has limitations. And if we accept this premise that it is possible to identify what you want, regardless of what anybody else wants, which is not possible, but if we accept that it is, and you accept that you should do it, you will be racked with this kind of anxiety about like, oh man, am I doing that thing that I'm supposed to do where I know what I want?
That makes me sick.
And you never ever will. And so the people who say that to you are trying to help you and unwittingly and unknowingly put you in a position that's going to lead to you being more anxious.
Yeah.
Because you're trying to do what they told you to do. But it's been packaged as
I care about you.
you're trying to do what you want to do. But the reason you're trying to do what you want to do is because they said you should. So you're just trying to do what they want you to do. And that's not bad.
It's not bad.
Especially because the people who are saying that to you are likely people who genuinely care about you. And that is one of the factors we want to take into account. Like, look, if two different people want me to do two mutually exclusive things, and this one really cares about me and that one doesn't give a crap about me, like, as a general rule, this one's going to work out better. Some other things like how similar are they to me? The more similar they
Yeah.
are to me, the more likely that if I base my thoughts and feelings and actions on what they're communicating to me, that it'll go well.
My advice giving is so. I keep just doing a generalized "this is why," and then you go, partly.
It's one of the reasons.
That's the reasons.
I think of life as a great experiment. No should, just choices. I will evaluate the product of the choice and either keep making the choice that produces what I desire. If a theory doesn't produce the result that I desire, I'll try another theory/choice. Cool. Great. Yes. Like it. What if this theory doesn't produce the results that you desire? Will you change this one?
Oh no! How do you change that one?
Also, if I wanted to be a jerk in different ways, and of course I'm being a jerk with the intention of being helpful, but the stuff that actually helps almost always makes stuff worse in the short run. Let me say that differently. In the kinds of things we're discussing, the way that people think and feel in therapy relevant things, generally speaking, the stuff that's going to help for one person to do for another person, because it's about communication and impact, is generally going to be unpleasant stuff. Because everybody's trying to do the pleasant stuff. And so some of that helps, a lot of that helps, but the versions of that help, everybody's been doing. You know what I mean? Like, if I'm looking for something that I've lost, and I'm like, I always put it in one of these three places, and I've checked those three places, and it's not there.
Mm-hmm.
And then I check those three places again, and it's still not there. And then I check again, like, it's got to be one of. Logically, right? You've checked those three places. You could argue about how thoroughly or whatever, but it's always possible that you missed something because even perception isn't 100% accurate. It could have been right there and you just missed it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's never the case that there was no point at all in trying to check again. It's always at least possible.
Mm-hmm.
But every time you check, every piece of any resource that you spend, attention, energy, whatever, on that attempt, the chances that doing it again will be impactful or help solve the problem go down. It's never impossible, but it goes down. And after you've checked it the 40th time, there's really not much chance. It's still technically possible. Not much chance. So if you look in a place where you're like, no, it can't be there, because wherever it is by definition now one of the places that you have determined it cannot be. So you have to now say that can't be a reason I don't look someplace, because that has to be true of wherever it is.
And then you start looking based on other variables, not like where you think it is or where it's supposed to be or whatever, but like, okay, let me just retrace my steps. Where could I have had the opportunity to put it?
Just made my medicine the other day.
The chances shoot way up of like, will this result in you finding it? Does it mean you will? No. But like the strategy you pursued, there's a law of diminishing returns. Each unit of a resource you spend using a strategy returns less value than the previous unit of that resource spent on that strategy. So it's better to switch to a different thing. Even though the thing you switch to might not work or might even make it worse, it's still better to then switch off of that one to another one. The solution is almost always better to switch strategies more quickly rather than try to pursue the same strategy. But that's counter to what we're taught and what we think about thinking. Like, my thoughts must be accurate, so where I think it should be is where it is. So anyway, the reason that the stuff that we do that is much more likely to be impactful is unpleasant things. It's because all the stuff that everybody thinks is going to help has been tried a lot. Not that it wouldn't continue to help, it could potentially, but we're a lot more likely to find stuff that is of great value by talking about something that nobody has thought about whether it's relevant. That is the origins of therapy originated in two different places and then like kind of combined. The one everybody thinks of is Freud and psychoanalysis. That's the origin of that, right? Is if I give you information about what you're thinking and feeling and doing that you did not previously consider to be relevant and point out to you how it is relevant, then now that you can draw new conclusions, and that can have huge impact by just saying like, have you considered that maybe this might have something to do with your father's leaving your family when you were young or whatever? No, I hadn't considered that, and this is now. So there's a fundamental part of what analysis is like just pointing out that some things you haven't considered to be relevant might be. They got kind of twisted and warped over time into like giving the correct analysis instead of just drawing attention to something that you didn't previously consider. No, I've thought a lot about my abandonment issues, but maybe I'm wrong about how I thought about them. So anyway, I was saying another way to be a jerk about this and then explaining that, of course, I'm not intending, my intention here is not to be unpleasant or cause an unpleasant thing, is to be helpful. And I care so much about being helpful that I am willing to take the risk of doing something unpleasant that might not help.
Special skill.
It is very unusual for people to prioritize helping others and also be willing to take the risk of doing things that those other people won't like. Typically, when people are okay and comfortable with doing stuff that they think other people won't like, it's because they don't care very much about helping that person. And typically, when people care very much about helping someone else, they try very hard to make sure that they only do things that that person would like.
I'm thinking about like a coach and how they kind of get away with more, come on! Like,
Yeah. Yep, 100%. That doesn't excuse all behavior or mean that all
Right.
that's okay. Because again, to some extent, some of those people end up becoming people this creates a conflict. If I care about what another person's experience is, which must be true if I want to help them, I must care about what their experience is. Then I also care about what their experience in this moment is. So if I do something that they don't like, plus I'm listening to them, and if they're telling me that this isn't helpful, I could be wrong, like whatever, right? So that's an inherent conflict. And people resolve those conflicts in different ways. And most of the most common stuff you hear people say that's kind of crappy in one way or another in this realm is just an attempt to resolve that conflict. Anything of like, look, if for me to help someone, they have to want to be helped, is a way to resolve I don't want to do something they don't like, and doing things that they do like isn't working. Well, they gotta want something different, whatever. A lot of coaches, I assume many coaches understand that no, I do genuinely care about these people, and I'm using this language and having this impact intentionally because I think it's beneficial. But a lot of the time that dilemma gets resolved in a different way, where it's like, your feelings don't matter, I don't care. What I care about is shaping you into the kind of person that you need to be, or whatever. And of course it can get very extreme, and it turns into a worldview sometimes that gets applied to everyone and everything. People are just whiners and complaining about stuff. Anyway, the thing I could do is point out, what do you mean choice? Instead of saying would you be willing to change this theory, I could say, what are you talking about? Choices. Choice still emphasizes conscious thought and intention, But whatever you consider choice to be, you have to acknowledge that the vast majority of what you do involves no choice. Even though it could theoretically, like you breathe, but you're not choosing to breathe. Even though you could choose to stop breathing for some period of time, and then the choice is removed from you. You sleep, you get tired, you feel things, your body is doing stuff all the time that you are not choosing. And your ability to choose to do differently is very limited. You can choose to stay awake until you can't. You can choose not to express your sadness to other people until you can't. Again, that hyper individualism, the idea that everything a person experiences is a result of their own being in some way, shape, or form, their choices, the way in which their body is constructed, them. It's not true. This is why I don't feel like I can tell my friends right or wrong things to do. I can only relay what I know and what I've experienced, but relating to my experience tends to turn the conversation back to me. I'm trying to get better at asking questions that encourage them to keep explaining if they want, but also don't pry too much. I mean, that's all wonderful. And, you're describing it in a very general sense, because that's when we're talking about things on this level, you have to get general and vague.
I'm
being more
laughing
specific would be more.
because it's relatable.
Yeah, I'm trying to do enough to be helpful, but not too much so that it's not helpful. It's just different ways of saying, like, I want to help, and here are some variables that I have identified as being impactful and helping. As a general rule, and I'll say this, I train my therapists on this, but I'm going to offer it to everybody, but your mileage may vary, kind of thing, right? If you share something from your experience in order to relate to another person and try to be helpful to them, and you are conscious of the fact that you don't want it to now be a conversation about you, and then it starts to become a conversation about you, that means it's happening despite your efforts to make it not be. Meaning those people are then interested in whatever it is that you've said and are asking questions or talking about you. You are trying to get it off of that or trying to keep it off of that. But that's an ego thing. Meaning, like, there have been times where I've had the experience that people say, like, hey, you made it about you and I didn't like that. Or maybe there haven't been times where people have said that, but I have evidence to worry that it has happened or that it's likely to happen. So now I put a lot of resources into trying to make it not happen. Well, that's about trying to make it so that you don't have the experience of feeling bad because somebody said you made it about you, which is taking it away from trying to be as helpful as possible. If your goal is to be as helpful as possible, like you said, sometimes the thing that's going to pop into your mind is a story about you or just information about something you've done, and you would say that. If you don't say it, you're now prioritizing not what is most likely to be helpful, but what is most likely to be something that the person likes or causes them to think well of me, or at most, what is most likely to make sure that a person doesn't think badly of me or isn't upset with me. If they're asking about you, if you say something about your life and then they're talking about it and asking about it, even though you're trying not to, then that means they think what you have to say is valuable and important, which again, you probably wouldn't have said anything in the first place if it wasn't already pretty clear that they think that what you have to say is valuable or important. Like, if you're trying to help somebody by saying something to them, you have reason to believe that that person might be impacted by the things that you say. They might care about what you have to say. So if you cut the conversation off or try and shift it back onto them or whatever, then again, you're prioritizing whether they think you're cool over whether you're helping. And most importantly, and I do my best to be a living model of this, but also to call attention to it didactically. The thing that is the most helpful, and also the thing that is most likely to make people like you even more, is to actually prioritize whether you're helpful, even over prioritizing whether or not they like you or are mad at you. Which is part of what people are saying when they say, hey, you got to care about what you want. I mean, sometimes I have an idea that if I say this thing, it'll be helpful. And I'm wrong about that stuff all the time. Do I take the risk of trying it? And the specific context differs. The stakes can be higher or lower. But oftentimes the risk that if it doesn't work out, the downside is that that person might be upset with me. Mm-hmm. And the reward is that it might help them. Do you take that risk? how often, in what specific context, what exact ratio are you looking for? If you're talking to people about this stuff, they already think you're cool. I'm using cool as a placeholder, just that they think highly of you in some way, shape,
I'm
or
like,
form.
cool.
They already think you're cool, or you wouldn't be having this conversation in the first place. You wouldn't be saying anything to try and be helpful if they weren't giving you reason to believe that like what you say matters to them. So by telling them about yourself, you're giving them information that they want. You're relating to them. You're normalizing. Sure, people are aware of those things, but mostly you're modeling confidence, as opposed to choosing your actions based on like, will they be upset with me or not? You're choosing your actions based on what do I think is most likely to be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And you're modeling that. Like, you're worried that other people might be thinking you're talking about themselves too much. Guess what other people are worried about, which you know, because you're saying you don't want to pry too much. So you're saying, I am aware that people don't always want to be talking about themselves. So if they shift the conversation onto you, that's a pretty good sign that they'd rather be talking about that than about whatever they're experiencing. And there's two things that confuse this for people. One is, but I like talking about myself with other people. I like having attention on me, whatever. That goes back to that same premise we've talked about a bunch, that like, if you like something, it's bad and you shouldn't do it.
You have 4 minutes.
Just because you like it doesn't mean it's bad. The second thing is, well, I like it, therefore maybe I'm making them do it or making it happen even though they wouldn't want to. Which, okay, fine. If you want to talk in an analytical sense, we can tell a story about how anything anyone is doing is truly, in reality, an attempt to elicit the response that it elicits. But that's kind of just like trying to reinforce the hyper-individualism that you're in control of everything and prioritizing cognition that like secretly you knew what people were going to do in response to you. Fine. If you want to do that, you can do that. You can make anything about it. But if you know that you have a conscious intention not to make it about you, or that you have a conscious intention to be helpful to the other person, then that's what you're trying to do. Right? So
I do think it's valuable to relate similar experiences. I just start with a personal anecdote sometimes, and then I realize I'm going to have to spend 10 minutes explaining it. And that's a long time to shift the conversation.
sure, and you could be referring to different things, so let me clarify. If what you mean is I tell an anecdote about myself and then people ask questions or express some like confusion about it, and so now I'm answering questions, then it's what I'm talking about. If what you mean is I start talking about it and in anticipation of some questions that they might have, I start, which happens all the time. I do it all the time on this stream, right? In part because I'm trying to guess what questions people might have, because I'm not confident that they will tell me. You know, some people are going to be watching this theoretically later when I'm not here, so I'm trying to guess. But I do it in other contexts too. It's not a bad thing to do. It's just so you start telling a story and get to a point where you're like, oh, you know what? I got to explain this other thing, and oh, I got to explain this other thing. Now again, because you're already telling me that you don't want to make it about yourself, overwhelmingly likely that what you're doing is, as you get to that part of the anecdote, you're recognizing, you're reading in the other person some confusion or a desire for more information, and you're giving it to them without having them ask you for it. In which case, if I was training you as one of my therapists, I would say, don't do that. If they have a question, let them ask it. But I wouldn't say that to just anybody, because I know that it is true that people all the time are confused or have a question and they don't ask it. In therapy, part of the work that we're doing is structuring things in such a way to get them to a place where they interrupt and ask those questions. You're not necessarily trying to do that with your friends and stuff. So that's why I'm going to then say, okay, so I'm hesitant to start. So it's not a response that you're reading, it's an anticipation of, will people be confused? Will people want to know things? Oh, we got to get going. And I was going to do a thing. We can't. Remind me about this next time, about how if we prioritize our thoughts about how people might respond to something before we do it, what that really is that we're doing there. Trust people that they'll interrupt you and that they'll ask questions and that they'll tell you, even if they don't say it verbally and explicitly, you are watching like a hawk for, are they uninterested in what I'm saying? Trust that they will give some sign of it and that you will be able to determine it and stop, instead of trying to guess how it's going to go.
That's the prioritizing the thoughts. Sure, my thoughts are they might not like it if I do this thing, but I have other thoughts that are also it might be helpful if I do this thing. What are you willing to risk? And the different context is different. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't. Sometimes it's worth it. Sometimes it's not. Just be aware that that's what you're doing. Part of you thinks it would be helpful. Part of you thinks they might not like it. It is possible for something to be both, but it's also possible for something to be they don't like it and it makes the problem worse. Just make that consideration. Be aware that you're making that consideration. That's what you're trying to figure out is not will they like it or not, but am I willing to take the risk of them not liking it? Where do they gotta go? It's fun.
See you next
With you all.
week.